Good evening. Happy New Year. For those of you who I have not had the pleasure to meet, I'm Richard Sommer, the Dean of the Daniels Faculty, and I want to welcome you to tonight's lecture. Before we get started, I'd like to do what has now become our traditional land acknowledgement and acknowledge that the land on which the University of Toronto operates, acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, for those of you that are visiting the Daniels building for the first time, I'm excited to welcome you to the faculty's main hall, which is designed in part to engage our broader communities in discussions and debates on how architecture, art, landscape, and urban design can affect meaningful change in our society today. This particular event is part of our longer series this year called Home and Away. And as the title of the series suggests, it brings together talent and ideas from near and far, people that are affiliated with our faculty or with Toronto or with our region, and people from other places that might share something with the work that we're doing here to have a series of discussions and debates on design issues of global significance. We have really already this year, but we will continue with a host of incredible lectures scheduled to take place over the winter and into the spring. And I would encourage all of you to visit our website and have a look at the lineup. I want to highlight two upcoming events that I want to put those on your radar. The first one is something called the Urban IQ Test, which is a symposium which kicks off this Friday evening with Orit Halpern, Michael Sorkin, and two Jessies, Jessie LeCavalier and Jessie Chapins. And then we'll continue with a series of very interesting panels. This will be presented along as part of the programming we're doing with the School of Cities at the University of Toronto, and it will take a deep dive into some of the contemporary rhetorics, histories, and politics of the smart city phenomenon. The symposium is free and open to all, and links to register for this event are available again on our website. The second event I want to put on your radar, and please don't miss this one, is a week from tonight, a joint presentation and dialogue in this hall between two fascinating and somewhat infamous artist, designer, provocateurs, Krzysztof Wodiczko and Raphael Lozano-Hemmer. If you've never seen either of them, I highly recommend you come. They're going to be making, as I said, a joint presentation of their projects and talk about the kind of political issues they're taking on with their work. So now on to this evening's featured speakers, Ville Kokkonen and Charles Stankievech. Both Ville and Charles are, among other things, exploring the role and place of technology in art and design. Ville Kokkonen is an industrial designer and researcher originally from Helsinki, Finland, but was educated right here at Toronto's Ontario College of Art and Design. His practice centers on the impact that technology has on objects, material performance, and future living conditions, with a particular focus on strategic design and new product development. And he's working on things such as instruments for using light in therapeutic ways and how bio-transformative devices can clean the very air that we breathe. Ville has lectured and worked across the globe, and he is currently a professor of practice at the Aalto University in Helsinki. Charles Stankievech, our representative of home tonight, one of our own, is an artist with a diverse body of projects and research. Among other subjects, his work has explored the notion of field work in the embedded landscape and the military-industrial complex, alongside the history of technology. Charles's work has been exhibited around the world, including shows in the US, Europe, and Asia. He is a founding faculty member of the Yukon School of Visual Arts in Dawson City, Canada, and in 2011, he became a co-director of K. Verlag, an art and theory press based in Berlin. Here at Daniels, some of you may know that Charles is the director of our programs in visual studies. So what I think is worth noting and understanding about these two speakers and why we've brought them together here tonight is that each of them has arrived at their practice, Ville in design and Charles in art, from somewhat unconventional backgrounds and training to do what it is they're doing. For this reason, I think they're both working in ways that defy certain expectations we might have about art and design, respectively. Ville's work raises questions about how design and useful objects are supposed to be situated and perform in society today, and Charles's work raises questions about the lines between art, research, and performance. We know that it is too simple to make distinctions between art and design around just questions of their function as commodities, or the way in which they do or do not perform practical functions. And I think these kinds of questions will animate tonight's conversation. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the format tonight, and then I'm going to bring Charles to the stage to set up tonight's presentations. So Charles, where are you? Okay, everybody welcome Charles Stankievech.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to kind of set the format for the evening. I want to thank Richard, of course, for the welcoming remarks, as well as kind of programming the series along with Jeannie Kim. It's great to have Ville here in his old town where he first kind of started his academic history. Also, thank you for pairing me with him. It's kind of a pleasure for me. His practice is very inspirational. As Richard kind of said, we are quite different, one could say, on the surface of the projects that we produce as a designer and an artist, if we want to use quick labels. But hopefully tonight we'll be looking at how we actually do overlap in a lot of the projects that we look at and a lot of the interests that we share. Sometimes I think that overlap will be complementary, as in we're actually using a lot of the same methodologies, and I think at other times we obviously are pulled in different directions. So kind of that compare and contrast is more the name of the game this evening, instead of two, let's say, people in the same field splitting hairs. Along that, I want to kind of give 5 anchors for the evening of 5 terms that we both have chosen in the past conversations that we've had that perhaps might be useful to navigate. And that would be research as a methodology. The second would be technology itself, perhaps more from Ville's side as a future-orientated aspect of use, but of course he'll probably challenge that in my more historical aspect of talking about technology. We'll also be looking at the diagrammatic, I think, or the aspects obviously of design and visual thinking and material thinking. Fourth, we'll be looking at material culture, how I think we're both very, very concerned while we look at systems of thought and how our objects or projects, of course, look at systems that are social and about ecological issues, that there also is a deep sense of the material, down to nanostructures, to ideas of how concrete and paint pigment and forensics analysis kind of work. And then finally, probably one of the most common things is the concept of temporality, a certain obsession, shall we say, with how things have been done historically, and really trying to mine that to understand where we are and to make kind of relevant assessments and possibly future projections. So even the concept of the evening will be probably a little bit different in format. I'm going to ask Ville to come up and talk about his work, and then I'm kind of going to go a little bit meta. And there'll be even a difference, I think, in the process. So please help me in welcoming Ville.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Okay. Okay, first of all, thank you very much, Charles, and huge thanks to the organizing faculty here and the university, and thank you very much, Ala Roshan, since after several years this kind of things came together, and I'm happy to be here now again. I studied here, as you heard earlier, in Toronto, and I couldn't believe that when I write yesterday that the city has really grown immensely, so I guess Toronto is doing really well. So I'm very, very glad to be here, and I'm very privileged to be actually in this city, and I realize there's few old colleagues in the audience, and perhaps some old friends from from the time. But let me first briefly go through my background after I moved on from here. So currently, I run an office, a very small office in Switzerland. I lived there the last 5 years. And it was a kind of a circumstance that I thought that I need to go into new surroundings, and perhaps that partly relates to some of the works that I'm currently doing. You'll see later on. But I did my master's after graduating from OCAD in Aalto University in Finland, and right after that I joined the research group. It was a group that had designers, economists, and the economists had futures research as their main agenda, and a few engineers. And it was a Finnish government-sponsored project that took 3 years. And we tried to find different ways how to visualize products that are not out there yet. So we had this 20-year projection that we tried to utilize research methods like scenario planning, snowball methods, future forecasting, and so forth, as a tool that designers and product development teams could use in order to convince clients or decision makers how to go forward. And I wanted to show these two images because currently I think my practice is at the same time extremely craft-oriented, hands-on. I still produce some of my own prototypes even, and at the same time my partners that I work with are either scientists or engineers that are not that linked to design, but very much at the brink of either working on new materials or new ways how to treat materials, or even just methods of how to look at the future. So, and one perhaps an important part of let's say the lifelong education was to work inside an industry for a while. I worked for a Finnish venture company called Artek, a very old company in the Finnish terms. It was founded in 1935, funded by Alvar Aalto, Aino Aalto, Niels Gustav Hallenmeier Gulliksen, and their idea was to not just provide furniture made out of birch plywood or solid birch wood or birch veneer, but to actually look at the world, how we use items, how do we live. And they even named one of their initiatives a propaganda center for new housing ideology. So it's a really interesting time for me to be involved in that, in a way, that legacy. And I ran a small design team there. And if you think of furniture, which is actually the field that I perhaps know the most within product design currently, and I also teach furniture design at the university in Helsinki, there's not that much that one considers when you think of a chair or when you think of household items, that how could that change? Our human bodies are more or less the same size as 100 years ago. We need to sit, we need to rest. Quite often the chair has 4 legs, a seat, and a backrest. So at that time, this was early 2005, and I joined the company, and we started to think, with the small resources that we have, what could we do differently? How could Artek as a company kind of refresh and be something else than just providing furniture, develop and design piece of furniture? So we kind of looked into different ways that what is ownership? what is the legacy if you buy a vintage piece of furniture? How do you treat these pieces, let's say, if you get, or if you inherit from your parents? We started this project called the Second Cycle, and we looked into the values that people give to piece of furniture and worked together with Nokia Research. And I don't know if many of you remember this flip phone. This is way before Instagram. It was the first NFC phones that you could, NFC standing for Near Field Communication, that could read RFID chips from a distance of, let's say, 1 meter. And we started to test that how could one gain ownership when you buy a new piece of furniture or when you buy an older piece of furniture. We downloaded information about that, and at the same time we were able to get information from it. So, for example, the later development working with Nokia Research at that time was that we tried to embed sensors also into piece of furniture that one could actually start to get information triggered by pressure, volume, or movement. This was an incredible project until Nokia took a different direction, and we kind of never published it, except this Second Cycle project continued in a way that currently you can go to Helsinki and buy used piece of furniture and compare the prices with new and old. Within that industry, I think working in industries has been extremely valuable in a way that I started to understand the mechanisms of what is marketing, how actually narrow-minded and short-term companies look. Quite often it's maximum 2 to 3 years. And so we did a lot of with limited budgets, we looked into new materials. This is one case where I was researching how natural materials could be utilized in different ways. It's a paper waste, a byproduct of a Finnish paper company called UPM. And we created this paper plastic composite. We researched how this could be used, what is the tactile feeling of this material. I designed with my team this floor tile. A Japanese architect designed this chair, which is called the L-unit, 10-unit chair. By using one component, you can repeat it and turn it around, and it becomes a set of furniture. We made a pavilion, so part of me working within the furniture industry was to actually also interact with architects, start to understand space differently, what is modularity on a larger scale, and so on. But not until this particular project on light, which brings me to kind of the what is the mature technique, or what are the material technologies that we live with. And the company had a portfolio of lighting fixtures designed mainly in the 1950s that related to the use of the incandescent light bulb. And we needed in the product portfolio lighting fixtures that actually lit up the space, to go away a little bit from the decorative light, which we still actually see quite a bit that the lighting companies are doing. So I also started to question the typology of the actual lighting fixture if we move away from the incandescent light bulb, which gives this 360-degree light around it. And we came up with 4 different lights, which you can see here. 2 of them give indirect light, and the other 2 direct light. So big part of this project was to look into in which circumstances we need light. How does the light look on the actual lighting fixture? What type of light, what quality of light it gives, what color of light it gives. In a way, it was really low-tech project, but we went quite deep into figuring out the right paints, the right quality of reflection, how people perceive light, and eventually ending up looking into the problematics of light, and especially in the Nordic countries and in Finland. Winter's been extremely long, and at that time, this was around 2010, there was on the market only these extremely instrument-looking devices that were called these therapy lights. And we conducted a quick research where we realized that people actually, after the use of the light, they hide it away. The aesthetics, the tactility was more like, let's say, an electronic device, like an ironing or a cooking machine. And so we ended up designing this table light that functions also as a reading light, but at the same time is something that you'd use early in the morning. It provides 2,500 lux and starts to affect the secretion of melatonin through the eyes. And through this project, perhaps I realized that within each new product development project or product design project, one, or at least my thoughts were that how could I design just a new item without actually going back to the roots? What are the early archetypes of a product? What needs to be done so that it's better than the ones that are or already in the market? Few years after that, this was already when I had my own practice. I got involved in a very, very different type of a lighting project where actually I was working with a larger team of engineers. This was an outdoor light, a park light that has a few different functions depending on the actual park or the location in the city where it's placed. And throughout that project, I was working constantly in the lighting laboratory. So I was surrounded by devices that measure light. We constantly tested something that we had invented that day. And I believe that that type of way of working, being involved in a workshop, working with colleagues that have a totally different background, does definitely affect the outcome. So that got me into optics, because in that project, the biggest task was to create an optimal diffuser that would spread the light in a different way, and we started to work with different ways to cast glass, to injection mold high reflective polycarbonates. And in a way, I did find myself that I don't have enough time to involve always this sort of extensive research before going to the actual finalizing of design, finalizing the form, and the other aspects of the product. But in this sense, these first projects, in a way, when you realize that what are the limitations of production, what are the limitations of your time and resources before everything else, I had this plan that how can one keep a small office but still maintain a very research-intensive practice. So that led me to actually utilizing some of the old networks that where I had earlier on approached and asked for information on particular performance of composites. The dialogue brought me to actually my future clients without me noticing that. So, for instance, I've been working a lot with a Finnish company called Excel Composites, and this is really, and in particular in carbon fiber, the company story of this group is that they used to produce the ski poles. So, coming from sport equipment and then later on moving into really high-profile, high-performance materials, they ended up with the client list where they're providing something that no one else can do, and as a result, quite often these projects are classified. So we came up with few concept projects where the products, there was not a direct client, but we could test and try to figure out what are the limitations of the materials, and these were also projects that one could show. So in a way, showcasing their know-how, but at the same time not necessarily being tied to corporate policies. I'm quickly just running through a few cases that I did with them. We tried to test tension structures. This is one problematics by applying these high-strength composites is that when you break the surface, you immediately lose the qualities of the material. So we tried to figure out a way how can one combine ready-made profiles without breaking the actual structural strength. So this is an active tension that keeps the structure, which could be anything, but we demonstrated with a small table, how to machine, how to lock parts together, and then we invented this sort of a locking mechanism that got inside the tubes, and then this extremely lightweight profile with the high pressure tension could combine these tubes together and then in that sense create a loop and a structure. These experiments led to a project where we also included a German solar cell company called Sunnovation, and also we worked with a Swiss solar cell company called Megasol. And at that time, at the same time, this company was really interested to go and work with architects and expand their know-how into architecture. So we are trying to combine what are the benefits of lightweight materials and photovoltaics. So as a result, and as an approach, we thought of this off-the-grid working platform. How could we make it foldable? What do we need to take into consideration to have enough power so that one eventually could just take it, pack it into a car, drive away, and get energy to either power up your laptop or your cell phone or anything else needed in that sense. Later on, we created a version number 2, and an Italian company, Manfrotto, that produces pedestals for cameras joined, and this is the outcome of the latest version. A little bit about the other end of some of the projects that I'm currently working on is a long-term collaboration with a prefecture in Japan called Iwate. For some reason, this part of Japan has been extremely interested in collaborating with Finnish designers. So there's a delegation of Japanese companies that visited Finland, and they showcased what is their craft know-how, what is their current craft skills that are a little bit diminishing. And I was selected with a colleague of mine, Harri Koskinen, to go and visit the factories, visit the local production. And one of these projects was the cast iron works, Nambutekki technique. And so in this project in particular, when you see an incredibly rich product type, or for example, this tea kettle, a product typology, what could one do? What are the ways that you can make it better, or what are the aspects that one needs to take into consideration to design a new item that already has been proven to the perfection? And how does this relate to, let's say, my current practice? I'll come back to this image, and it's something that perhaps the end user might not note when using it, but perhaps part of that discussion we will go into the ways that how this project is presented. And why I'm saying that is that this is not out in the market yet. It's actually being presented first time this February in Stockholm. But a little bit of what were the parts that made me consider that, okay, this is something that I have something to look into, or it's interesting also for myself. So nothing had really changed since hundreds of years of the development of the tea kettle. Some small changes, for example, the iron that they use, it's not anymore the ore, and they don't go all the way to how to produce iron, but they actually use old used cell phone parts and melt it and cast it in the sand molds. The design process was a lot faster. Today you can use transparent 3D printing, so we're able to quite quickly figure out which shape works, how the water flows. This kind of the practical, pragmatic ways how a normal design process would go today. But perhaps the biggest task was to try to figure out what and how are people using it, in what sort of context and what sort of environment these kettles exist. And only later on, when I, with the help of a translator, I started to realize that each kettle that you find in museums were unique, even though mass production with cast iron techniques had evolved. And it was based on the way they created the sand cast molds, that each mold broke immediately after the use. So there's not one identical kettle when you look at the historical works. And each kettle had an extremely refined sort of visual language that not even, let's say, I don't know, there must be some Asians or Japanese and Chinese in the audience that can read the kanjis, and you probably know these stories. But up until understanding and reading what is the meaning behind these characters, I started to understand that how important this product and the role and the context it carried. So this image shows that perhaps today the kettle would be used in a totally different environment than previously. So, for example, the imagery and the traditional old Japanese houses, that the act of brewing tea, not just the tea ceremony, but in a household where you have the below ground fire pit, which warms up the whole room, and it's quite often in the center. So it's an item that you constantly stare at. So these depictions that you see, for example, the shapes of the lid, each one of them had a verbal meaning or some sort of a visual clue to that mark, the kanji mark, what that shape meant. For example, if you look at the left row with the lids and the second one from below, that character shares the same name as this Japanese kabuki mask. And if you look at the curvature on the top, that's the forehead of the character of the mask just turned upside down. And then, for example, on the second row, the flange or the position of the opening of where the lid sits in, you take the second one on top that is kind of concave inside. And I think that character meant similarly an old woman, but not just an old woman, but old woman without teeth. So this kind of like sucked in shape with such a strong kind of a visual curve, something that you immediately understand what it means. It's something that one perhaps would not use in current today's marketing as a feature of a new product. So in a way, if one can't go down in the history or look into what were the reasons for particular forms, particular reasons how things were, I think we kind of would slowly lose big parts of the material and cultural engagement with artifacts that we live with. I'll jump into a different sort of project that now recently I've been doing also in my practice. This is a project that I done together with Florencia Colombo. It is an exhibition that was hosted at the Design Museum in Helsinki. It was commemorating an older Finnish designer called Eero Aarnio, who's fairly well known from the 1960s, that is behind the ball chair made out of fiberglass and the pastel chairs and tomato chair and so on, still live and kicking. So this was his retrospective exhibition, and it was hosted in an older building, and we really tried to figure out what could be the ways that, let's say, mainly pieces of furniture that were designed in the 60s, how they could be exhibited and how we could engage the audience within that exhibition that was running that summer 2 years ago. So usually there are these vitrines, there are drawings that are hung on the wall, there's different sort of structures that display items, and but quite often it doesn't that much challenge the way people move or how exhibition architecture is done. And at that same time, I was doing tests with a robotics company in Helsinki. On the left-hand side, there's a mock-up of one of these automatic vacuum cleaners that cleans these spaces. So what we did is we just hacked it and used this algorithm with laser sensors that when the vacuum cleaner usually senses a wall, it turns around. But now we had this possibility to manipulate the information that the laser sensors were given. And in that sense, we created mobile platforms. So part of the exhibition was your usual vitrines, cages, how we showed how things are produced, but at the same time, we wanted to implement this mobility and things in movement. One of the key ideas that triggered us to design these mobile podiums was that quite many of the pieces of Eero Aarnio were to be seen, or one can approach them from 360 degrees. If you look at your regular chair, it has a direction. It has the backrest, it has the front back legs, and you kind of realize that there's the backside. But in this case, the classic pieces of furniture by Aarnio are circular shaped. So I'll just show briefly how it worked. This is the video clip is a little bit speeded up, but you can see these podiums. This is the opening evening. You can see the audience still in the back. And the idea was that there was a 360 degree sensing laser guiding system in each podium that actually gathered quite a bit of information from its surroundings. There were staircases at the end, so we had to tape these magnetic tapes so that it wouldn't run off. But we realized when we were doing the first mock-ups in the museum space that actually all the information that we gathered was extremely accurate. So eventually we just made kind of a choreography that what would happen when, let's say, a person would approach this podium. It would first slow down and then it would stop. So we were able to play the way they function, always having kind of like a random direction. We were scared that otherwise they would just either clog. And now we're working actually on a secondary prototype with them where we could actually figure out also color and sound. So we could, there's this possibility that we could figure out who are the German tourists or who are the people that wear red pants, and it could easily start following these particular triggers, and it would create quite a different experience. And since time with us is fairly limited, I'll speed up a bit. Perhaps if there's time later on, we can come back to this. But another project that was also related to exhibition architecture and quite a bit about Finnish material culture and how we perceive things, what are the values that we give to items, which items still work and which don't, is this exhibition called 10,000 Years of Design, Man, Matter, Metamorphosis, which is currently running in Finland. Also created and the exhibition architecture done by myself and Rosan Colombo, where we looked at the archives of the museum. What has happened between all these years? Which are the forms, which are the shapes, which are the materials that still work? and how they have affected the way we perceive them. We really started to look at also the meaning of design, since the word design in Finnish is actually form making. And the 10,000 years comes from the fact that's when the Ice Age sort of ended in the northern part of Europe. That's when people moved in, and that's when people started to make things with their hands. And in that sense, I think, and we strongly believe that is design, whatever is created. Perhaps it's good to conclude to this, and I'll give the mic to Charles. Thank you for listening. That went so quick.
All right. So I'm going to be presenting, like I said, I think in quite a different format. Particularly, though, it's kind of nice to see and hear what Ville was saying, the anthropomorphic aspects of people's faces and the visual aspect for design, and let's say the tracking of people wearing red pants and surveillance might have a little more connection to my talk than I originally intended. What I'm going to be speaking about is the show that I did at the National Gallery about a year and a bit ago, around a painting by Poussin in the 1620s that was acquired by the National Gallery under consultation of Sir Anthony Blunt, the infamous art historian and, of course, the Soviet double agent. And the exhibition looked at various models of knowledge and analysis, particularly its connecting to the practice of connoisseurship, or actually the birth of connoisseurship at this moment, and drawing a trajectory of that through to forensics as a method that can articulate, let's say, the overlap between the positivist sciences and kind of more of a conjectural science, or conjectural methodology as in the social sciences, and then obviously within the fields of art and design. So importantly, I kind of want to connect with the specific case study of forensics, but in a way, this becomes for me a way to talk about some general aspects of design and art in a more universal way. And then, so hopefully we can kind of do that flip, zoom in and a zoom out. So I'll sketch out kind of a particular history, and then that will provide hopefully a background to the conversation and questions between Ville and myself. So the images behind me are the installation images of that exhibition. I'm going to be working from some notes on this. I don't usually do presentations of showing my own work and talking about it. I usually do more historiography, and I think the looking at history and talking about it in a way is really important for understanding the projects we make and the products we make. So much like Ville in a way. So we need not look any further than the etymology of the word exhibit to observe a long and parallel history between the spheres of art and design and also within the legal sphere. So the word exhibit literally in Latin means to hold out, exhibere, right? Particularly within a court of law. And the first known use of it is archaic. It's from 1490 and refers, of course, to a religious administrative act. And this might be a place for us to come back to in a moment, obviously with the history of curating and the etymology of curating, to cure or to care, particularly to care for souls originally before it came into the afterlife of caring for objects. By the 1500s, it becomes a legal term, much more static in the way that we're used to it today. And by the 1700s, it's used to describe a public exhibition or a play, as well as some drawings. But the drawings are not fine art drawings, let's say, of the masters, but rather illustrations in scientific journals and publications. By the 18th century, all three of these meanings of the term coincide, right? The legal offering, the scientific rendering, as well as the performance of theater. And particularly, let's say, in the 19th century, the World Fair comes out, and we use this term, and then by the 20th century, of course, we talk about art. By the 21st century, the most common watched television show is, of course, CSI, which is about the forensic process, and particularly cybernetic forensics. So contemporary art and design is no less concerned with these multivalent crossovers, particularly within exhibits. And the most common desire in today's art world is to exit, of course, its own hermetic ecosystem, as founded on, let's say, modernist ambitions, to create art for art's sake, or to perform a pure Greenberg formalism, perhaps to talk about a speculative art market, or to mere society. Right? So rather, the current zeitgeist is based more on a post-Walter Benjamin idea, where we are to make things, of course, a poiesis, to go back to Aristotle, to change the world. Right? Even if that is used cynically as art washing and so forth, to talk about it without any real sincerity. So the latter part of the 20th century saw the emergence of playing with semiotics as the logic for art production. Obviously, we've seen that under identity politics, and the 21st century really kind of urges us in a more concerned way with globalization and pushing these even farther in their diversity. So not content to say, create another image for a world saturated with images or another object destined to obsolescence. The rhetoric, of course, is to anchor meaning and value outside of the art world. Two exact concepts could be easily referred to under many, such as the last curator, artistic director of Documenta 14, looking at his mega exhibition as the forum for witnessing objects or evidentiary objects. Not to mention, of course, the Turner Prize this last year, which nominated the Forensic Architecture Group, an agency, a group of artists and designers, for that prize. So in a sense, celebrating at this moment this crossover between design and art, and particularly along the lines of the original meaning of the word to exhibit, right? Both the art exhibition and the legal sphere. So much of art and design, of course, has had a very illustrious history, but it's also been very suspect. Right? It's at least been subject to much graver concerns in history, whether we're talking about Plato's banishing of the artists in the Republic, or the Chinese literati in the Song Dynasty being very skeptical, of course, of the vibrant colors of commercial art. Medieval artists, right, illustrating religious iconography, later to be critiqued by iconoclasts, or obviously the social realist painter as a cog in the machine of social revolution. So, at the avant-garde manifestos of the 20th century, even exhibitions, there was this design and desire, of course, to break out from a certain religious context, a certain political propaganda, a certain aspect that was different than the atrophied academies. A certain autonomy, shall we say, as fantasy as that seems. And so it's public proliferation after that, I would argue, in art schools, which is quite different than, I would say, the Royal Academies, is important to think about, and particularly as it morphed in the latter 20th century into the ecologies of universities, something like here, for instance, at the University of Toronto and elsewhere. And in a sense, this produces a certain critical practice, a critical art practice, a critical design practice. So this is supported, obviously it doesn't just flourish by itself, it's supported by academic positions. Both Ville and I are obviously professors. We're here giving academic talks, academic publications, Kunstvereins, artist-run centers, biennials, and of course the host of public museums for both art and design that have exploded in the last couple decades. So cross-pollinate all of this type of methodology with let's say a methodology of a graphic design and a product design, a visual design that's rather analytic in itself. We have, of course, PhDs and creative research that is funded by national foundations. So despite this privileging, I would say in the context of the university, something I know our faculty has to wrestle with within a giant research university, visual thinking has increasingly become a process evolving beyond mere illustration. Example, Exhibit A, right, to support an argument. Rather, instead we're dealing with a methodology and a tool to conduct analysis itself. So historical case studies framed and interpreted by political scientist and designer Edward Tufte have for decades been balancing this aspect of design to be both communicative but also to construct meaning. So both communication and construction is what I'm very interested in. I know he's kind of a classic case study, so I'll be brief, but Tufte's example of John Snow's successful intervening in a cholera outbreak of 1854 demonstrates the role of mapping and diagrammatic thinking to make causal connections. So along with a good idea and a timely problem, there was a good method. And so to quote Snow, the detective work that Snow exhibited was about shrewd intelligence discussing evidence, but also a clear logic of data display and analysis. So case in point, Tufte demonstrates how simple divisions of space for displaying data would create radically different conclusions. Furthermore, it was his visual understanding of sight related to mortality that created a causal connection and thus created effective policy. Right? So here visual renderings explain causality. The reason we seek causality in these explanations is, of course, to intervene, or as Tufte says, to govern the cause so that we may govern the effect. We create pictures of the world, we create models of the world, of course, to change the world. One of these greatest shifts is the picturing of the world which occurred, of course, half a millennia ago, the systemization of linear perspective as a projective geometry. And this, in a case, elevated art to a scientific methodology. And this is kind of what I'm interested in. Quite literally, the world was framed by a gridded world, as we know, and assisted in analytically parsing it square by square in a checkerboard, and also, of course, created different planes in the depth of field, from world to painting to the mind's eye. The result, of course, was a feedback loop that was a hallucinatory oscillation between sensing, thinking, and making. So I kind of joke sometimes that Descartes, before he rationalized space, artists and designers and architects were already playing chess, as well as, of course, the conquistadors, when they went to the Incan Empire, considered the landscape a chessboard for their conquering. So colonial conceptions of space complicate the narrative of perspective as a subservient to, let's say, a trajectory of realism. Instead, maps this type of process to perspective's oblique history to cartography. As Erwin Panofsky once pointed out, and we all know, perspective is symbolic. So one could say these symbolic renderings are diagrammatic in their double function, both as framing but also as creating plans for the world. The literal overlap of the strategies could, of course, be, and we all know, the blueprint, drawings of planned sections and cross-sections. Now, architects and artists with a penchant for philosophy, like myself and others like Peter Eisenman and, let's say, Greg Lynn and so on and so forth, have since the 80s been keenly interested in Deleuze's concept of the diagram, borrowed, of course, from Foucault, and his varied discussions of the microphysics of power. And this, of course, is first done and explained within the Bentham's analysis of the panopticon, right, his plans for this prison. So in a particular case, we have the discursive or the non-discursive here. We have the written penal code, and we have the architecture or the visual schematic design of the prison itself. And it communicates both the apparatus, but it also creates a schema for the world by both designing a prison but also concretizing a practice of surveillance. The optical dynamic of seeing without being seen functions as the core here. And this doubling is kind of interesting in a design practice and an art practice, because the diagram here is both obviously the visual communication, but the content is about visuality itself, either in a prison or in exhibition making and so on. So in other words, I want to kind of move a little bit laterally to a philosopher or an art historian by the name of Abby Warburg to talk about the conjectural method and particularly the birth of the art connoisseur. So historiographer Carlo Ginzburg, he astutely observed that the art connoisseur and the detective may well be compared, each discovering from clues unnoticed by others a clue of a crime and finding the author to that crime, and a clue to who the author of a painting is. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York offers classes taught by a lawyer and an art historian to detectives, to police detectives in New York, to improve their deductive observational skills by looking at paintings within their own collection. And not ones just of crime, but rather of character studies and so forth. So this connection between, let's say, detective work and art and design may seem like a leap unless we kind of look at a particular methodology as developed by Abby Warburg, and that's called iconology. And last night when Ville and I were having dinner, kind of looking and reading at this quote, it was something I think that both resonated for us in its ability to have a comprehensive analysis of a historical understanding, how objects are made and how they talk about history. So to use Warburg's words itself, analysis should be free-ranging with no fear of border guards and can treat the ancient, medieval, and modern worlds as a coherent historical unity. An analysis that can scrutinize the purest and the most utilitarian of arts as equal documents of expression. How such a method, by taking pains to illuminate one single obscurity, can cast light on a great and universal evolutionary of processes in all their interconnectedness. Right? So that whether it's a design object, an everyday object, a folk object, or a fine object, any one of these, of course, can speak to each other and perhaps are the clue to unlocking its use, its understanding, and its future. Warburg's final project, the Miocene Atlas, and you'll see an example kind of this, of the black screen coming up with some portraits, illuminates this most importantly. It's a final project that he never finished, and it was an open-ended series of presentation screens that had photographs, you can see it up there, loosely connected to a certain theme together. Rather than following kind of an iconographic or typical art history narrative of, let's say, tracing an image throughout history, a saint's illustration or rendering at one time is related to another time, or following the master painter and collecting all the works under that single one, he rather followed, or these Miocene Atlas screens rather followed the law of the good neighbor, right? That was based on his library that is well known in London. That is that you don't need to know or find out what you need to know in the book you already know, but rather it's the book on the shelf beside it. In short, Warburg establishes a certain sense of research that flourishes with Sir Anthony Blunt in London, which was the point of this show, but also at Princeton with Orhan Panofsky. Such a lineage, of course, is old news, and it perhaps is more important to talk about it in the more nascent practice of contemporary curating. Warburg is commonly quoted in saying that his process was hopefully the power to react against prevailing trends in art history. So these atlas maps a certain migration of images according to their own logic and become a methodology for looking at the past to understand the present that perhaps surfaces in something like Harold Zeman's very little known but very early exhibition Science Fiction from 1967 that collected about 400 different objects and kind of in an obsessive way, like Ville and Florencia's show, from toys to science fiction to narratives to fine artworks, as kind of this comprehensive looking at how we make things. So where does this conjectural thinking come from? Ginsberg locates it in the 16th century at the birth of connoisseurship, at the schism between the positivist sciences and the social sciences as they relate to geography, art, and history, and so on. As contemporaries in Rome, on the one side we have, of course, Galileo Galilei, who established a predictive model of science based on the repetition of results. And on the other hand, we have a much lesser-known figure by the name of Giulio Mancini, the Pope's doctor, and one could argue the first art connoisseur, who establishes a conjectural model based on that when causes cannot be repeated, there is no alternative but to infer their effects. And of course, this is a methodology of a doctor. When the patient is dead, and you can't really kill them again, so you have to, of course, look at the symptoms, the organs as they failed, and from these signs and symptoms deduce, of course, what the cause of this process and history of the patient was. So, taking that methodology in a sweeping historical mapping, Ginsberg locates Mancini's conjectural method along a path, starting with the narrative practice of hunters, and them themselves tracing animal tracks. So this idea of looking at how tracks tell you where something's coming from and where, of course, following those tracks, where it will be going to intervene in the hunt, and the narrative process that's developed out of that practice, through to statistical models in the 18th century that quantitatively tried to process human phenomenon, and with this mathematical rigor, give a certain sense of authenticity and value and validity to conjectural methods. It ends up in 1880 with Thomas Huxley and a series of lectures aimed at publicizing the discovery of Darwin, defining the Zadig method as a procedure common to history, archaeology, geology, physical astronomy, and paleontology, or that is, the fields that are about making retroactive prediction. Before ending the essay, he makes an expected stop, of course, at Foucault's Panopticon with a little footnote, and discusses the birth of forensics as a visual analysis that is bridging the gap between the history of visual studies or the history of images and a scientific methodology, particularly in Herschel, Bertillon, Locard, Francis Galton, right, the people who invented fingerprinting, the mugshot, and other anthropomorphic aspects. While it's common practice to disavow these pseudosciences of the 19th and 20th century, somewhere perhaps we could say it's a bad mix of photography's novelty and the seduction of technology, something that happens with every version of technology coming around the corner, and of course Darwin's radical orientation of the origin of humanity. But there's a certain, I think, lesson or certain thing that lingers which we need to continually test, and that is, can we distinguish between predictive and conjectural models of knowledge? Forensics, and I would say design, is inherently at this crossover as it uses the language of science and aesthetics. The question, of course, is when is it productive to mix these models and when is it productive to keep them distinct? In one, we trace a history of an object in order to locate it within a crime, and the other, we might be able to glean its history and thus the successful traits that were evolved within that object to optimize future design. I've often stated quite rhetorically at this university, and much to the protest of most of my fellow colleagues, that art is about asking questions and design is about finding solutions. I'll be less rhetorical this evening, and assume, of course, that's a certain flattening of practice which we're challenging tonight. That art cannot at moments, can at moments be purely aesthetic, can be about affect, as well as design, of course, can be critical in its sense of asking us questions about the social sphere as well as about ecology. Critical practices, therefore, can span this entire spectrum, as they do at universities, and I think can be found in practices like Ville and myself. So with that, I want to invite Ville back up to the stage to continue the conversation. So the idea is here, we're going to ask a few questions, of course, before we open up to the public. So really encourage you to be thinking of questions. So it's not always that shock of when we hit the floor and everyone's quiet, that it is coming. So Ville, I wanted to kind of make a comment or ask a question about the invisible. Now, your practice is very visually acute. Obviously, all the projects are quite beautiful. But yet, through a lot of these practices, there's this almost kind of thread that I've noticed, some of them you've shown tonight, but a lot of them you also didn't show, of kind of a certain working through of the invisible. So, for instance, perfume and scent, or the electromagnetic, tactility, these types of ideas or these kind of systems that we're working with that you can't directly see. And is this something that you're conscious of, or is this kind of a mapping that we're kind of looking at, that maybe I'm just drawing these out? And if there is a kind of paradox or contrast between working in a visual medium and dealing with these kind of source material?
Very good question. This actually came about when I started to go more into understanding what is actually light. So I went back to my old school books about physics and really started to kind of go into the rudiments, what is light and actually how we can use light to even detect what's the material in Mars. It's all about actually the photon, but as you say, invisible, but it's still, we can touch and feel, and it's haptic. So through that, when you separate the different light waves, the different colors, why the sunset is red, it's because of the longer wavelength, and then the whole, let's say what is in the air, trying to find the English word for light scattering. It's actually that I realized, okay, this is really close to a current project that I was doing with Comme des Garçons, which is the perfume. So when you bypass a person, even if you have your eyes closed, you realize, oh, this guy was wearing this perfume, and it changes the way you move, the way you react. Similarly, like you can't see temperature, but you immediately react to it. And that led me to work with an air purifying company based on questions that I had asked them about clean air and what are I wanted to become a better designer. How can I design a unisex perfume that really works and it could trigger something else than how the packaging or the bottle looks like. So there's so much that one can actually go deep into, but then you just have to cut and then stop and decide, okay, this is enough. But what I realized, I don't know if you answered your question, but what I realized also from an earlier discussion that you mentioned that when you are doing research for a project, is there an ending, and when do you actually think that was enough and now it's ready to be presented or to be discussed? How far do you go? And since I work quite a bit with a brief or with the client, and I know when I need to end. But in the case of art, when for you does it end? When are you satisfied that that's enough research that you've done?
Of course, you never. I mean, I think it was Lawrence Weiner who once told me, if you forget to put the salt in on Wednesday, put it in on Tuesday. And it's this kind of expression that one can be very revisionist, changing titles, remaking work. Next time you exhibit it, change it. So I think first of all, our work is not as static as we like to think about it. Even when the museum collects it, sometimes you go back to the museum and you're like, actually, I figured out a better way to exhibit this or display this, and you kind of talk to them. And I guess as you get older, you kind of get a few more tricks under your belt. And so even in like the archive, that doesn't happen. So I think the first thing is just to acknowledge that maybe there is that ending that never happens, perhaps in a way that's different than design, because you're such artists are such megalomaniacs and they're always changing and reducing things. They don't have that public, okay, we've reached something that now you own and it's different, you release it. I think it's almost less than design. But in my case, it's because I'm usually starting with a contemporary problem. So I know we were trying to ask the other day when we were talking, at what point do you become more contemporary, or what time period? And I've always had this practice that I'm trying to be more contemporary. I would like to think about the future, but before I get there, I want to do a little bit of historical analysis, and then I just get absorbed and I keep going backwards. So you start in the Cold War, and then you make a project about network theory, and then you're like, oh, but to understand that, I need to understand the bunker, and then I need to understand, sound experiments in World War I, and you start all of a sudden your shows start going backwards in history, when your first question is about surveillance and contemporary society. Yeah. So, I think there's always that contemporary brief of what seems very urgent in it, in the politics, in the practice, and it's that question of always like, okay, that's great. That's interesting historical knowledge, but what does it mean today? So it's more of a shaping in that regard, not did you find the exhaustive survey of history, or did you find this right particular moment? It's rather what is the lineage that best constructs something to say, okay, this is where we are today to understand this particular moment. The shows are always, or the projects are always about that contemporary. I wanted, I mean, maybe it's a little bit of a stretch, but talking to you and a few other people, that there's almost this kind of a similar analysis of history for you as you make an object. We talked about, the design methodology of, okay, we have a glass, we have an object, and let's go through hundreds of different forms. Tweak this, close that, right? And we were talking about the bottle and the form of the hand there versus the hand there, and these moments of we could tweak this infinitely with rapid prototyping and design and CAD, and these variations are endless. Versus the design methodology that's, okay, where did this object that functions today come from? And is it more important as a methodology to understand that history? I guess particularly for you, I mean, everyone has different ones, but how do you balance that contemporary type of design and, let's say, a more historical, let's call it forensic analysis of the history of this object and how it became used through time? Yeah.
There could be two, maybe the approach, there could be two parallels. One is that going back to the early versions, the first vessel, let's say if you talk about the bottle, to contain a liquid, and you might, or in the case of design, I think that is a tool to kind of enrich your alphabets. You might get an idea from the past, because quite early I look at the existing, let's say, what's out there, what's already selling. If you talk about a product that it's not going to be an new innovation because of new technology or something else, let's say, so the bottle in this sense is a good example. So that one part is to kind of clean out the current situation and look how it was done before and why. In the case of the champagne cork, for example, it relates all the way back to the German army going to Africa and not wanting the cork to pop out, and that's how the champagne bottle end looks like now with the cork and the screw. So these are fascinating, but then that's kind of giving you, in a way, it's this reverse engineering that helps you understand how things are the way they are. And then when you have that wealth of information, it's easier to try to do the one that has not been done before, which is quite impossible. At least it's a tryout for that. But then again, I think what's an interesting challenge is that when you're working either with a new technology or with a totally new tool or a product that has not been done before, what signs, what visual information, what language do you use to even describe it to someone? For example, before the mobile phones came, what was the analogy? What was the formal development of them before the technology existed? If someone would have said, how would this device look that you can speak with? Maybe it would be more similar to these mics that we're wearing than a solid item that you have to hold in your hand. So I think that might be a similar case with you. You if you want to be contemporary, you have to first, what is contemporary? You have to first kind of look way beyond that.
But I mean, I'm going to ask kind of an annoying question. In these briefs, or in this way of thinking of looking at a history of an object or a history of a use, a tool, have you ever come across one that you kind of said earlier, I kind of was writing it down, how do I understand this so I can make it better? What happens when you run into an object that can't be made better? Or is there a sense of humility that occurs, or is it a certain sense
Constantly.
So what happens then? Okay, you can't just fetishize the object. I mean, you don't go back to the client and say, the champagne cork was invented a while ago. It's working great. Let's not do anything about it. How do you approach something within that kind of historical arc?
Yeah, that's actually quite important. You do your research and you try to buy time to get more research. My perhaps the way I approach it is that I first question I hardly ever, and also I don't have the chance to say no to a client if it's a boring brief, which actually hasn't happened. I just want to know their interests more. So if the company would want to make another glass like that holds the same amount of liquid, I really start a dialogue with them. But perhaps the next dialogues are with the research that I've done, and then I question, why don't we approach it in a different way? And then that brings the project somewhere else. And in a way, then it's this narrative and the discussion with the client that then becomes, in a way, the new brief. But I guess I have not worked with projects that are so in that level that it's kind of like you just do this, all the dimensions are given, and in that sense.
And how does the
so it's the dialogue.
Yeah. Really. How does the supernormal? I mean, you were telling me the supernormal concept in regards to that, right? Of how do you make something better, and the concept of supernormal as a design kind of term. How does that fit into something like this?
Yeah, there are items that have really survived the test of time. They're classics. They could be, in the case of the supernormal, it was very much about the anonymous design that we don't know who was the design. There's no ego, or even sometimes even not even a brand behind the item. So items that work well, that it would feel ridiculous to make them better by applying formal new formal language to it. In that sense, let's say if we talk about everyday items or tools or products that don't necessarily have a breakthrough technology behind them that they would change every second year. You look into the way we use them. So, for example, the way we eat constantly changes. We're working on this project with a Finnish company called Iittala about eating. They're launching a new tableware set, and what are their arguments that there's another new wine glass using clear soda glass, there's another ceramic vase that we can put food into and eat from it. So what are their arguments? So the discussion that we are having is that the way we interact when we eat, for example, has changed. There's the French kitchen, then there's the à la Russe, the Russian kitchen, and what is the way we eat today? Do we have 3 plates stacked? We start from the first. Do we have the 3 knives, the 3 forks? These have changed. So in a way, it could be argued that the context, the way we consume has changed, and then that's an argument to create another one. I don't necessarily always believe that, but that's the discussion.
And along that lines, I know you mentioned a little bit the concept of the prototype, and in particular, I mean, it's kind of nice to see some work that today can't be published, right? Or in the sense that when a design brief is unsuccessful, it kind of gets buried, maybe for liability, maybe for copyright or IP and so forth, and the successful model goes on to production. While in art, perhaps it's all about this original object. The copy is, in some sense, maybe a multiple, but authenticity and tracing and understanding this authorship is obviously very much embedded in the art process. Your projects, a lot of them are kind of remain at the prototype level, or is this? Can you maybe talk about that in regards to prototype as a failure, or actually as an interesting mode of research in itself, or is that? Do you distinguish between that? Which is almost a goal? Is it better to make a work that goes all over the world, or is it better to have maybe an object that existed in a research process that you learned something, or so on and so forth? Do you ever have to kind of juggle that?
No. The prototyping work that can be published, the benefit of that is that quite often that's about a developing technology that one would not want to freeze the project and try to bring to the market. So it's this, the moment it's in an unmature stage, and the function of the prototype is to get information and get comments and as a discussion, but it's also, as much as I hate this term, it's a marketing tool. It's really, it's a device to bring the company into a different level. If company is only, it could be any size of company, if they're only kind of doing this research and development and never showing anything wild or anything, let's say, courageous, and kind of reveal what's happening inside the company, these type of projects that are published but not gone into production is one way of communicating what they believe in and what are their values. Also kind of promoting themselves, which is one way to do it. And eventually that's actually the way I see that there's this old pragmatic way of thinking that a designer is, the function of the designer is to create items that are mass produced and can be used. But I think currently there's so many different designers, and I think that the role of the designer of being involved in the process and designing something that's not necessarily mass produced doesn't limit. It's just, in a way, this old way of thinking. If something is designed and it's published and people can critique, comment, the project is still ongoing. Images live longer than perhaps sometimes the physical objects.
And I know you don't really necessarily want to talk about it, but you brought up two kind of examples of exhibition making in the presentation today. The one at the National Museum, about 10,000 years of design and making things. And I wanted to ask two things of that. What does the form of the exhibition do for you that other forms don't do? Say the market or prototyping. And two, what is curating for you in that process in regards to research? Obviously, we normally think of the exhibition as the end product of something. You've done a bunch of research, either as an artist or a curator. You research methodology. You want to show this now, or an art historian. You've done the research, and now you're putting on public display. Is that kind of how you see these things, or is it also more of a research process in itself for you to look at 10,000 years for a future project? I mean, are they interleaved?
No. Yes, the fact behind this that I don't call myself a curator, and I would not. It was more of a project that we could realize that the National Museum was very interested in. It started off a dialogue of, or actually several different dialogues. What is the archetype? What is the role of the museum? And in this case, the Finnish National Museum has an incredible archive that, let's say, 80% of the items that are in the archive will never be visible for the people, because they're just lacking space, and to start to digitize them, to even have the proper images, it's quite a lengthy, expensive process. So the dialogue, actually the discussion started from this particular movement in Japan called the Mingei movement, where particular arts and crafts sectors were highlighted in a way to, one of the main key persons behind this was Soetsu Yanagi's father, that what is Japanese material culture? The anonymous craftsman, the perfect ceramic vessel, the right color of urushi lacquer, or the cast iron pot, and we started to discuss what would be in Finland the anonymous item that is currently still used, or we know, and it's dissimilar to the eastern side, to Russia, or the western side, the monarchy, the Sweden and Norway. And as a Finn, it was quite evident, and I have been using these things since I was a child, and then Florencia, in that sense, as an Argentine Italian, looked at it from a totally different perspective, and we managed to say that there needs to be this exhibition that's done from a designer's lens. So the selection, in a way, was not categorized. It was really about the function, the form, the qualities of an archetype, how it is done. So in a way, that quite loosely, we got free hands to do the curatorial work on our own. It was very much about comparing, very much about, it took a year and a half to go through most of the archives, but there's still lots that we never saw. And after close to 700 different items, we were able to narrow it down to 300 items that were shown at the end. It was not non-taxonomic, it was not linear, there's no hierarchy. We came up with 5 different themes and grouped these items within thematics. Also compared them with current items that perhaps came from the old archetype but now are done out of different material. It was a bit also commemorating that Finland just turned 100 years, being an extremely young country, and that was kind of in the agenda of the museum.
I mean, I think we should probably open it up to the floor quickly. So if anyone has a question right off the bat, we'll definitely jump into it. We have one up here at the front.
Hi, my name is Josh Sewell. You mentioned at the start, very briefly, embedding RFID chips into items. And then you talked about the animation of furniture with the putting them on the Roombas and having them react to people. I was just wondering if you think that re-imbuing items with a history that people can trace would give us a new appreciation for the things that we build and possibly bring us back from the brink of everything being disposable and ordered from Amazon or from IKEA. Whether you think that we can come back from that and start revaluing craft and putting more effort into the things we make.
Yes, it would be easy to if we would just discuss furniture, which is something that quite often is, or at least should be built durably, that it lasts longer than your student years. I'm referring to the Swedish company. There's this really interesting notion that we realized when we started the second cycle project, where actually the heritage of the product was collected when we gathered this old piece of furniture. For example, from 1940s, there was a story of the previous owner, and then that was written, the text was then implemented in the tag, and one could read it and realize, okay, this is quite incredible. This piece was actually found from Turku, it used to belong to this doctor. There's a story, and then on the next side you had a brand new one, no scratches, no patina, no heritage, and all of a sudden you realize that the price difference, you value the old one a lot more. So that mechanism was only later on realized that what incredible power these stories are to these items. Of course, it's very different if it's personal, if it's your grandfather's lighting fixture or a chair. But what's interesting that during that project, actually Sony audio design team contacted us and were really asking how could they do this for their electronics, for the Sony Walkmans that they have been gathering and collecting over the years. And we had this discussion for some time, but we kind of never nailed it down that what could be done with with things that have technology that it doesn't work anymore because of the shift.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Hi, you can I was just wondering, since you're a designer that considers your practice is based in research, if you could directly address Charles's conjecture that design is rooted in solutions and art is rooted in questions.
Actually, yes. It's a good way to say it. If you expand if you go a little bit further, taking time into consideration temporality, finding solutions. Sometimes there might be temporary solutions to a larger problem, or then attempted failed solutions in some instances. But well said.
Any other questions? I'm wondering if you could, about that and solutions. I feel like one of my favorite projects of yours, which we didn't talk about tonight, was the perfume. And perhaps you found a solution that no one really wanted to know the answer to at the beginning. Obviously there's lots of students here, and how you navigated this issue along those, let's say, cliche analysis of question and answer, or the autonomy of art that doesn't have the client versus the designer who does. And of course, this is always just how you determine what that temporality is, of who's the client, the museum or the collector. We all have these kind of clients in a way, or we can all spend time researching independently. And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about the standard scent, and how a furniture designer, when you were out of furniture designer, ended up producing a scent, and how that happened or didn't happen, or how that perhaps was a solution, or was that question how would that fit into that?
Yeah, that was a project that perhaps could have been one of those that it would have been like an exercise in graphic design and packaging. But the initial sort of beginning of that project was that we, as a really, really tiny Finnish company, we were struggling to open up markets in different countries in Europe, and we came across of a small exhibition at the flagship store of Comme des Garçons, which is the Stova Street Market in London, and we realized that the team there, the owner, the head Grand Dame Kawakubo-san, was really interested of the brand and the heritage of Artek being about art and technique, not just commercial furniture. And we actually wanted to collaborate, do something together that's not furniture design, that's not fashion. And we started to talk about the Comme des Garçons Parfums, which is located in Paris, and about living, changing our clothes, using pieces of furniture, fabrics, textiles, and we agreed to try to design a scent for a space or for a location. But then came the problems with the contents of the liquid. The alcohol content might cause problems when it comes to painted surfaces, and we didn't want to do a scent that's an incense that burns. So we kind of took this really long route of exploring, and then we ended up, there's some smart guy in the meeting who just said that actually it might be quite commercially good to actually do a unisex perfume. That why don't we make it a profitable project, and that's how we ended up doing it. Then on our side, I still was debating on that, would that be enough? So we started this. Usually the perfume development process, you work really closely with the nose, who is able to make the magical chemistry happen. But it started off from notes that we gathered from Finland that somehow related to the company. We sent them off to Paris, where he made 13 different samples, and we conducted this study that what is actually a unisex perfume. Do we actually have, why would men, women, and everyone, how could, it's the same discussion with the color. Is there like a gender link to a color? Is there gender link to our taste buds when we eat? in the restaurant there's no food for women and food for men or food for the rest, and it's just ridiculous. So I looked into that. We did this user study and started to categorize answers coming from different genders. At the end of the day, we narrowed it down to 3, and then I thought, most likely in my lifetime I won't have another chance to design a perfume. I just made the last choices by myself, which I liked. So that's just the one fun part of the project.
I want to ask about the critical function of design. In Charles's presentation, he highlighted the dimension of the social and the environment as 2 avenues for critical practice and design. When you spoke of critical in your presentation, it was in the context of the movable plinths for that furniture exhibition. And I'm just curious to ask how you understand the critical function of deciding in that decision to use movable rotating plinths.
From the audience's perspective, the critical, we took that project more as it was long discussions with the museum, but I guess we never took it all the way to actually do an analysis of it, or even have kind of an explanation. We did it, it worked, and sort of that's it. It could have been brought to a totally different level to have a discussion about it, commentary, but perhaps the design work is more about the project is more or less done when you have finished it, which is actually not true, but it could have been brought to a larger discussion, which we actually unfortunately never did. It's only been debated and discussed later on with colleagues. For myself, it was very much about the technical challenge, the excitement of what can be done. And unfortunately, that particular museum doesn't have a strong feedback, or doesn't have a critical audience to discuss. It was actually a totally different topic. Actually, unfortunately, in Finland, or I'm not sure what is in Canada at the moment, but there's a very little critical discussion about design. Even the main newspaper, there's not a design journalist that could actually comprehend what the discussion is. It's very unfortunate.
Do we have maybe one last question before we wrap it up? No? Great. Thank you very much for coming. And of course, please come back next week for Christophe and Raphael. Thank you.
Thank you.